On this episode, we have two stories about people who come back from outdoor adventures with life-threatening conditions. Our first story is about a retired doctor who returns from a rafting trip with debilitating pain in his abdomen. Then the second story is about a woman who ends up fighting for her life after going camping in Vermont. Here is our first story called Gut Instinct. In early July of 2021, 71-year-old Thomas Trizona dragged a large inflatable raft across a sandy beach on the Colorado River. It was just before sunset, and he was sweaty and tired, but happy. It was the last day of a 2-week whitewater rafting trip in the Grand Canyon, and even though he desperately needed a hot shower, Thomas felt invigorated and youthful. Thomas was a retired surgical oncologist, which means he was a doctor who operated on people with cancer. He loved being a doctor and had always been a total workaholic. But after retiring earlier this year, he finally had time for himself. And one of the first things he had done was take this adventurous vacation with his wife, Amy. Whitewater rafting had been as thrilling as he had hoped it would be. They'd floated past Native American ruins and through canyons with cliff walls stretching nearly a mile over their heads. They had seen eagles, condors, and bighorn sheep. Now, on the last night of the trip, Thomas and Amy secured the raft and joined the rest of their tour group around the campfire. Thomas's stomach growled as he watched their guide grill another delicious meal for them. Thomas looked forward to dinner and then one more night of stories around the fire. Tomorrow, it would be time to return home to Springfield, Oregon. But for now, Thomas just gazed up at the setting sun, knowing he'd cherish these memories forever. On July 16th, so a few days after returning home to Oregon, Thomas sat at his dining room table feeling bloated and nauseous. His wife, Amy, had prepared a beautiful dinner, but Thomas only pushed the food around on his plate. He told Amy that his upper abdomen really hurt. He'd started to feel sick shortly after getting home from their rafting trip, and he was now starting to lose weight. And this morning, it seemed like the pain had gotten even worse. It was now coming on in these big waves. Amy suggested that maybe he ate or drank something weird on their trip. Maybe he contracted a parasite. Thomas said he only drank the filtered water, and he didn't have diarrhea, which was a common symptom of parasite infections. And anyways, if he had picked up something on the trip, then Amy would probably have it too. But when he looked at Amy and asked her how she was feeling, she just kind of shook her head and said she didn't feel sick at all. Thomas knew that his wife was probably right, and his pains were no big deal. But as a retired doctor, Thomas couldn't resist diagnosing himself. Just in case it did turn out to be something serious that required him to see his physician, Thomas began keeping a detailed journal to record all of his symptoms. He thought that this journal would help him understand what was causing his pain. Thomas had seen some heart-wrenching cases in his long career as a cancer surgeon, and as he tracked his symptoms over the next few days, he started to get nervous. He wanted to stay open-minded about what was causing his symptoms, but he couldn't help gravitating toward the dreaded disease he knew so well: cancer. Thomas reminded Amy that his mother had died of pancreatic cancer when she was only 74. In his experience, a previously healthy 71-year-old man with persistent abdominal pain and unexplained weight loss could only mean one thing. Until he was proven wrong, Thomas was certain he had cancer too. Thomas picked up his cell phone and called his close friend, Jonathan Gonen. Dr. Gonen was a gastroenterologist, a doctor who specialized in the stomach and intestinal tract. Thomas told his friend that he wanted a CT scan to figure out if he had a tumor in his abdomen. But unfortunately, the earliest appointment Dr. Gonen could get for Thomas was a few weeks away in August. Thomas hung up the phone feeling disappointed. There was nothing he could do except wait. A week later, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror squeezing toothpaste onto his brush. And then he looked up and felt totally alarmed by his reflection. He was pale and gaunt, his weight was now down about 15 pounds since he'd returned from that rafting trip, and now he could barely stand from the fatigue he felt, let alone brush his teeth. Just then, a bout of nausea swept over Thomas, and he rushed to the toilet. He dropped to his knees preparing to vomit, but nothing came out. All of a sudden, he felt these severe spasms in his stomach, as he fell over sideways onto the floor. The tiles were freezing cold against his cheek as he lay there shivering in just his boxers. Then he called out to his wife and said he needed to go to the emergency room right now. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat next to Amy in the emergency room's crowded waiting room. His blood had been drawn by a nurse, and he was waiting for the results. Thomas's phone pinged. He grabbed it and opened a message to find the results of his blood tests. All were normal, except for one. He had elevated levels of a type of white blood cell called eosinophils. That, Thomas knew, could indicate three things: an allergy, a parasitic infection, or cancer. Thomas had already decided that he didn't have a parasitic infection, and he didn't think he had an allergy either. So that left only one possibility, the one he most suspected: cancer. Thomas asked the nurse at the reception area if he could speak directly with the doctor about the results. She told him that they had a long list of patients that day with serious problems that required immediate attention. Thomas could wait if he wanted, but it would likely be 4 or 5 hours until a doctor could see him. Thomas considered his options. He was pretty sure he did have cancer, but he knew he likely was not in any sort of immediate danger because of the cancer. And no matter what a doctor would say to him that day if he waited around to speak to one, it would still take way more testing to determine if he really had cancer or not. So Thomas stood up and told Amy they would just leave. He would deal with his cancer tomorrow. The next day, Thomas sat across the desk from his primary care physician. The doctor looked at the results on his computer as Thomas tried to describe his symptoms. And then at some point, the doctor asked Thomas about his diet and routines. And then after hearing what Thomas had to say, the doctor glanced up from the screen and told Thomas that, you know what, this is probably a dietary issue. And then he suggested Thomas try a grain-free diet. Thomas was stunned. He wanted to be screened for cancer. And now his primary physician was telling Thomas, a cancer specialist, to just try a grain-free diet? It seemed kind of asinine. And so Thomas just stood up and curtly thanked the doctor, and then took back the test results and left the building. 4 days later, Thomas was sitting at his dining room table with his laptop open in front of him when he got the best news he had received in a very long time. The results of the CT scan he'd finally been allowed to take had just come back. And the results were normal. He did not have cancer. Thomas felt an enormous wave of relief, but now he was more puzzled than ever. The pain in his abdomen had not gone away. He had barely eaten in the past 4 days, and he had now lost 22 pounds since he had returned from that rafting trip. And so Thomas was back to trying to figure out what was going on with him himself. And so while sitting at the dining room table, he began scanning through his journal with all of his symptoms he had recorded, while also going on his computer and looking up possible obscure disorders that might fit his symptoms. And as he clicked through these medical sites, he turned his attention to a chronic digestive disease in which white blood cells build up inside of the intestines, causing pain and bowel obstruction. Thomas knew that the condition, called eosinophilic gastroenteritis, was rare, but he was running out of ideas. He was growing desperate to know what was going on with him. He was in agony, both physically and mentally. And even though he was a doctor, he was completely stumped, and this made him feel so helpless. So eventually, Thomas just picked up his phone and called his friend, Dr. Gonen, to see if maybe he could help him again. A week later, Dr. Gonen paced inside of his office. He had just arranged to have Thomas have a tiny camera inserted down into his throat to look around inside of him to see if maybe he had a bowel obstruction. But like all of the other tests Thomas had undergone, this one too came back with normal results. Dr. Gonen was bewildered by his friend's case. He decided to order one more test to get a better look at Thomas's small intestine. The images on this specialized MRI would be much sharper than the CT scan, which would allow doctors to see very small problem spots. Dr. Gonen hoped the added clarity and details of the imaging would finally reveal what was wrong with his friend. The day after the MRI, Thomas went to the radiologist's office to discuss the results. Looking over the images, Thomas was surprised to see a tiny abnormality in his upper left abdomen. This abnormality was about an inch long and very, very thin. The radiologist told Thomas that the shiny spot looked more fuzzy on the earlier CT scan, and he thought it was just a buildup of plaque on Thomas's artery wall, which is a common sign of aging. But with the specialized MRI, it made it clear to the radiologist that he'd been wrong. Something strange was going on inside of Thomas's stomach. Then the radiologist had an idea. He was curious to see if this weird spot was stationary or moving around inside of Thomas, and so he offered to do another CT scan right then to find out. Thomas agreed, and they performed the scan immediately. And sure enough, it showed that the weird spot had moved in just a few weeks between one CT scan and the next. But before the two men could decide what to do about this weird, moving, skinny spot inside of Thomas's stomach, the radiologist noticed something else that required immediate attention. It might explain Thomas's chronic pain too. Thomas leaned in and saw on the image that there was another small spot. The doctor told Thomas that it was a gallstone, a hard mass that was growing in his gallbladder. Thomas and the radiologist stared at each other. Gallstones can cause severe pain and cause serious problems if left untreated. And so Thomas's inflamed gallbladder needed to be removed immediately. On September 13th, Thomas underwent surgery to remove his gallbladder. In the last moments before the anesthesia knocked him out, Thomas prayed that he was about to be rid of the terrible stomach pains he had endured for 2 months. A few hours after the operation was over, Thomas lay in a hospital bed resting with Amy by his side. His surgeon entered the room, walked to Thomas's bedside, and stood there grinning. The surgeon said that he had successfully removed the gallstone and the inflamed gallbladder, but that was actually not what was making Thomas sick after all. The surgeon explained that while he had Thomas's abdomen open, he decided to investigate that tiny, thin spot, the trouble spot, from the MRI scans. And he found something he had never seen before in his entire career, something that totally explained all of Thomas's symptoms: his severe stomach pain, his nausea, his weight loss, and his constant fatigue. The surgeon pulled a small vial from his pocket and held it up for Thomas to see. It contained a small object about the size and shape of a needle. Thomas asked what it was, and the surgeon said he wasn't sure, but it was very sharp, and it was inside of Thomas's intestines. And so no wonder he was in so much pain. From the looks of it, it was almost like Thomas had unintentionally swallowed a needle. Thomas leaned back in his bed, staring at this little thing inside of the vial. He couldn't believe that such a small object had caused so much misery. But he was obviously very relieved that the ordeal was now over. However, he knew he would not be able to rest easy until he figured out what this thing was that he swallowed and how he actually swallowed it. A few days later, Thomas took the object in the vial to a lab for analysis. The analyst found that it was a thin metal wire just under 1 inch long. What's more, they found a carbon pattern on the metal that exactly matched burned barbecue sauce. Thomas thought back to that last night on the Colorado River during the rafting trip and the delicious meal his guide had grilled for the whole group around the fire. That was the last grilled meat he had eaten before he started getting sick. Now everything was clear. The black metal object found in Thomas's intestine was likely a metal bristle from the brush his guide had used to clean the grates of the grill on that magical final evening of their trip. Thomas chuckled. He always knew that he would keep his memory of the Colorado trip for the rest of his life, but he didn't realize that he had also swallowed a little souvenir that would force him to remember. Here is our second story called Into the Woods. On a Saturday morning in June of 2009, a 55-year-old woman named Elizabeth and her husband Ron pulled their RV into a campsite in western Vermont. Elizabeth loved camping and took every chance she could to head for the wild. leaving behind her comfortable suburban life in Connecticut. But as she had gotten older, she had begun to enjoy the comfort of an RV. It was much nicer to sleep in a warm bed at night and not have to deal with the hassle of setting up a tent and then sleeping on the ground. The RV lifestyle was just so simple and so easy. Today, all the couple had to do was park their RV at the campsite, then put on some sunscreen, and then head out for their hike. And so, that's what they did. The dense Vermont forest they were in was beautiful, but Elizabeth had to admit that the conditions today were kind of miserable. The whole area was buzzing with these black flies that were swarming all over Elizabeth's legs and neck, and of course, Elizabeth had forgotten any bug spray. By the time she and Ron had got back to camp, every exposed part of her body was covered in bites, and over the next few hours, those bites turned into welts. Usually, whenever they went camping, Elizabeth and Ron really enjoyed lighting a campfire up at night and sitting out under the stars. But that evening, the black flies were so bad that they just stayed in the camper and played cards. Elizabeth and Ron were in good spirits, though. They'd camped in less than ideal conditions before, from freezing cold to pouring rain, and so they weren't about to let a few bug bites ruin their trip. But by the time Elizabeth changed for bed that night, her arms and legs were an unsightly mess. They didn't hurt, but all the red, swollen welts looked terrible. So she took a few ibuprofen to help with the swelling, and then she climbed into bed. The following day, Elizabeth and Ron got up and packed their bags and they headed home. And even though they had not enjoyed the black flies, they had had an overall nice time and felt energized from their weekend in the fresh mountain air. But for the rest of the week that they were home, Elizabeth battled this terrible on-again, off-again headache, and the welts from all those black fly bites were not going away. Elizabeth spent the following weekend at her niece's house in Long Island, New York. She was excited to catch up and spend some quality time with her family. But the whole time she was there, Elizabeth felt groggy, like she needed a strong cup of coffee. And then when she left and began driving back home, her headache came back full force to the point where it was just this constant, horrible throbbing pain against her temples. When she finally got home, she immediately took some ibuprofen to help with her headache, and then she drank as much water as her stomach would allow. She knew that black fly bites were not toxic, but her body seemed to be taking longer than usual to recover from them. That night, Elizabeth went to sleep early, hoping she'd wake up feeling better. But she didn't. She woke up in a cold sweat, and her stomach churned and her head pounded. She knew right away that she had a fever. Her husband, Ron, grabbed a thermometer from the bathroom, and sure enough, when he took her temperature, it was 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, Elizabeth was really starting to worry. She'd been sick now for more than a week, and she really didn't know how much longer this was going to last. And next weekend, she and Ron were hoping to go camping again in Vermont. They were going to meet up with Elizabeth's cousin and her cousin's husband. Elizabeth was really looking forward to the trip, but she was worried that her sickness, whatever it was, would force them to cancel. All week, Elizabeth tried to take care of herself. She stayed in bed, drank a lot of water, and ate well to help her body overcome this sickness. And finally, the morning before they were supposed to leave for Vermont, her fever broke. Throughout the day, she got better, and by that evening, she felt well enough to go camping. She was thrilled. For the first time in a week, Elizabeth got a good night's sleep, and the next morning, June 22nd, she and Ron loaded up the RV and headed back to Vermont. When Elizabeth and Ron arrived at the Winhall Brook camping ground, it was absolutely downpouring, which made it difficult to find their campsite and hook up their RV, but luckily, Elizabeth's cousin was already there and could help them get set up. When Elizabeth's cousin made a joke about the great weather they were having, Elizabeth thought about her last camping trip in Vermont and decided that she actually preferred this monsoon over swarms of black flies. Elizabeth invited her cousin and her cousin's husband into their RV, planning to cook some dinner while they waited for the rain to subside. But several hours later, the rain still had not let up, and so Elizabeth's cousin and her husband ran back to their own RV, and Elizabeth and Ron, they climbed into bed and they went to sleep, hoping that when they got up, the weather would clear and they could actually go outside and enjoy the outdoors. But the next morning, when Elizabeth woke up, the rain was not remotely on her mind. Instead, she had this blinding headache, and she also knew immediately that her fever was back. Her skin was itching and her eyes felt red. Her mouth felt gritty, almost like it was covered in little bumps. Elizabeth was annoyed, knowing she was likely going to be sick all day and could not participate in anything they were going to do. Elizabeth rubbed her eyes and slowly made her way to the bathroom to brush her teeth. She debated whether she should just ask Ron to take her home, or if she could tough it out in the RV so he could at least still enjoy the vacation. Once in the bathroom, Elizabeth spit out the toothpaste into the sink, and she noticed her spit was bright pink. And when she rinsed her mouth, she tasted blood. She opened her mouth and stuck her tongue out, and her eyes widened as she realized the bumps that she had felt inside of her mouth were these black blood blisters all along her tongue and on the inside of her cheek. Elizabeth started to feel panic rising in her chest, and so she hurried out of the bathroom and over to her cousin's RV. Luckily, her cousin's husband was actually a doctor, and so he had Elizabeth stand in their kitchenette while he looked around the inside of her mouth with a flashlight. And after a minute, he turned off the light and just shook his head. He said he had never seen a condition like this before, and he urged her to go to the hospital. Within minutes, the RV was packed up and Ron was sitting behind the wheel. Elizabeth needed to use the bathroom before they headed off, but when she urinated, it burned. Now Elizabeth was truly worried. These were not flu symptoms. Elizabeth made her way to the passenger seat up front, sitting beside Ron. By this time, her headache was back and worse than ever. She popped an ibuprofen as they pulled out of the campground, but nothing took the edge off the pain in her head or the itching that had developed all over her body. It took 2 hours of driving down winding country roads to get to the nearest emergency room in Brattleboro, Vermont. To Elizabeth, every single time they hit a bump in the road, it made her nauseous with pain. By the time they arrived, Elizabeth was in pure agony. Ron parked the RV, then walked around to the passenger door to help Elizabeth get out. When she saw him, she smiled at him, but she could see his eyes were full of fear. It wasn't until she herself looked in the rearview mirror and saw her reflection that she understood why. Her face was so swollen that she almost didn't recognize herself. About 5 hours later, Dr. Teresa Fitzharris walked into her office at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, ready to start her overnight shift. She put her purse under her desk, then went to check on Elizabeth, who was her first patient of the night. When Dr. Fitzharris walked into Elizabeth's hospital room and looked at Elizabeth, the doctor tried to hide her shock. Elizabeth's throat, chest, torso, and entire back were covered in a bumpy red rash. Dr. Fitzharris played it cool, but she'd never seen a rash this bad before. Elizabeth also had a fever of 101.6. Her heartbeat was also elevated, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely see out of them. Dr. Fitzharris sat down next to Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth began to recount the last 2 weeks of sickness and misery and all the symptoms she'd experienced since getting bit by all those black flies. Dr. Fitzharris pulled 2 rubber gloves out of a cardboard box in the storage cupboard. She put them on, then gently ran her hand down Elizabeth's arms and back. And as she did this, she frowned. She was confident that this was actually not the result of black fly bites. But Dr. Fitzharris couldn't think of any other condition that would cause a rash like this. And until she could figure it out, Elizabeth was very likely to continue to get worse. At a minimum, the rash could cause serious, lasting damage to Elizabeth's skin. Her eyes could be damaged as well, and there was no telling what this mystery condition could be doing to the inside of Elizabeth's body. Dr. Fitzharris didn't really know where to start with Elizabeth, so she just ordered some x-rays and blood work, and then went to go check on a few other patients while she waited for those things to happen. A little over an hour later, after Elizabeth had gotten the x-ray and done the blood work, Dr. Fitzharris looked over the results on the computer in her office, and to her surprise, Elizabeth's blood work and her x-rays had come back totally normal, and so Dr. Fitzharris was stumped. So she picked up the phone and called one of her colleagues, Dr. David Albright, the infectious disease doctor who was on call that night. She walked Dr. Albright through Elizabeth's symptoms, and she could hear him scribbling notes down as she spoke. And then after Dr. Fitzharris was done talking, Dr. Albright let out a long sigh. He said that most sudden fevers, like the one Elizabeth had, were caused by viral or bacterial infections, and so the problem now was figuring out which one of those she'd contracted. Because Elizabeth had been spending so much time outdoors, Dr. Albright guessed that she might have an insect-borne illness like Lyme disease or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Dr. Albright told Dr. Fitzharris that he'd be in the next morning, and he promised to make Elizabeth his first stop. In the meantime, Dr. Fitzharris decided to put Elizabeth on antibiotics just in case she did have an insect-borne illness. If left untreated, conditions like Lyme disease or ehrlichiosis can cause organ failure. The doctor just hoped that she hadn't acted too late.
In het licht van de maan, laat de zomer nooit meer weggaan. De rivier stroomt, het water is zo koel. De kinderen spelen, duiken in het poel. De geur van bloemen, het geluid van de wind. Elke dag een avontuur zoals we het beminnen. Als de zomer komt, voel ik me fijn. Het leven is mooi zo dichtbij. We dansen in het licht.
Early the following morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of a knock at the door of her hospital room. She squinted through her swollen red eyes and saw the blurry outline of a person walking into the room. He then introduced himself as Dr. Albright and asked if the medicine that Dr. Fitzharris had prescribed was helping at all. Elizabeth groaned and shook her head no. She told Dr. Albright that she could barely see and her rash was more painful than ever, to the point where even a tiny shift in bed was extremely painful. He promised he would do everything he could to help her, and then he said he was very sorry, but he needed Elizabeth right now to sit up straight so he could determine how much her rash had spread. And so Elizabeth tried not to scream as Dr. Albright helped her sit up. Even the slightest touch on her skin was agonizing. As Dr. Albright looked over Elizabeth's body, he could see that the rash had spread, and it did not look like the medicine had helped at all. That meant his suspicion that it might be something like Lyme disease was incorrect. But unfortunately, he didn't really have any idea what else could be making her sick. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as Dr. Albright helped her lie back down. She knew the doctors were doing their best, but the fact that basically nothing had worked so far was still extremely frustrating. She could barely open her eyes and her whole body felt like it was on fire. About an hour later, Dr. Albright reappeared in Elizabeth's doorway. This time, Elizabeth could make out a second figure standing next to Dr. Albright. Dr. Albright explained that he'd brought a colleague with him who was a dermatologist, or a skin doctor, and his name was Dr. Jorge Crespo. Dr. Albright wanted Dr. Crespo to take a closer look at Elizabeth's rash. He hoped that if they could determine what kind of reaction this was, it might inform them what was actually making her sick. Elizabeth braced herself for pain as the doctors once again helped her sit up so Dr. Crespo could look at her. He spent a few moments examining Elizabeth's rash, checking her eyes and the inside of her mouth. Then Elizabeth saw him nod to Dr. Albright, as if to confirm a suspicion. He told Elizabeth that she had a rare but severe kind of allergic reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Dr. Crespo explained that she'd ingested something that triggered an incredibly violent response from her immune system. Her body was so desperate to get the allergen out of her system, it attacked the deepest layers of her skin, causing the blistering rash that now covered her whole body. Soon, he believed, the top layer of her skin would start peeling off. It would look worse before it felt better, almost like she'd suffered a severe burn. None of what the doctor was saying made any sense to Elizabeth. She assured Dr. Crespo that she hadn't ingested anything unusual over the past 2 weeks. She told him again about the black fly bites and wondered if maybe any of the flies could have been carrying some kind of bacteria or virus or fungus that could have infected her. But Dr. Crespo just shook his head no. What made Stevens-Johnson syndrome very unique was not only the reaction, but the thing that caused it: medicine. For reasons doctors do not fully understand, medicines that normally improve people's health can sometimes trigger this life-threatening allergic reaction in certain patients. In Elizabeth's case, Dr. Crespo was confident that the cause was one of the most common, easy-to-get, over-the-counter medicines on the entire planet: ibuprofen. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. She'd been taking ibuprofen steadily for the last 2 weeks to reduce the swelling from all the black fly bites and to alleviate her headaches. Little did she know, the medicine was causing all of these problems. But something didn't make sense to her. She told Dr. Crespo that she'd been taking ibuprofen for as long as she could remember. If she was allergic to it, then why hadn't this happened before? Why didn't she have a big reaction the first time she took it? Dr. Crespo shrugged. He admitted that he really didn't know why Elizabeth would develop this allergic reaction so late in life. Stevens-Johnson syndrome was so rare that the root cause of it was actually still unknown. But at least Elizabeth knew now that she could not take ibuprofen, and Dr. Crespo assured her that if she stopped taking it, that she would recover in about a week or maybe 2. Elizabeth was given steroids to help reduce her symptoms, and a few weeks later, she had recovered enough to go home, just like Dr. Crespo promised. But because her allergic reaction had gone untreated for 2 weeks, some lasting damage had already been done. Elizabeth's eyes had swelled so badly that her tear ducts were permanently damaged and no longer worked. Ever since, she's had to administer saline drops in her eyes every few minutes to keep them working properly. But Elizabeth likes to look on the bright side and has said at least she can still see. In 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police, because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone.
As a pediatrician who had treated some of the sickest kids, Dr. Liriano always tried to stay optimistic, even in the darkest times. But sometimes it was hard not to feel totally defeated. If Sheila's finding was accurate, Sebastian did not have much of a chance. Dr. Liriano had treated this same infection 4 other times, and in all 4 cases, none of the patients survived. Still, he felt a deep sense of duty to never give up. No matter how unlikely Sebastian's chance of survival was, Dr. Liriano resolved to fight with everything he had. He made some calls to get a team in place, and then he had Sebastian moved to a room in the critical care unit, and then he went to study Sheila's lab results more closely. And right away, Dr. Liriano could tell from looking at Sebastian's spinal fluid that Sheila's fears were right. This was the worst-case scenario. But there was one ray of hope. Dr. Liriano had heard of a new medication designed to combat Sebastian's condition with this microorganism. It was named Impavido, Spanish for undaunted. But there was a catch. The drug was still undergoing safety review. The makers of Impavido were still negotiating with the Food and Drug Administration for approval to get wider distribution, so very few hospitals were able to stock it, including the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano called the hospital's pharmacy. He told them he had a patient who urgently needed Impavido and to call everywhere until they found some. The pharmacist said they would and hung up. Dr. Liriano paced in his office, trying to think of how else he might be able to save Sebastian in case he couldn't get this medication in time. He knew of other patients who had died waiting for it to arrive. Just then, Dr. Liriano's phone rang. It was the hospital's pharmacy. They'd gotten in touch with the Centers for Disease Control, who had already tracked down the CEO of Impavido's manufacturer, which was based right in Orlando. And they apparently said that they had Impavido available and would be happy to supply the hospital with as much as they needed. Dr. Liriano felt a rush of joy at this news until the pharmacist finished their sentence. There was one problem. Impavido was stored in a safe at the CEO's office, and the CEO was out of town. Dr. Liriano groaned in frustration. He asked how long it would be until the CEO could make it back to the office. If the medicine didn't make it to the hospital soon, it would be too late to save Sebastian. The pharmacist said the CEO was away in Boston, Massachusetts through the weekend. There was basically no way he could make it back in time. But there was one other person who had access to the safe, the CEO's son, Michael. Not only that, but Michael was already on his way to get the Impavido for Sebastian. He would then personally rush it to the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic to hear this, but none of it would matter if it took too long to deliver the drug, and so he asked where this office was to gauge how long Sebastian would have to wait. And the pharmacist's answer that the company's offices were only about 10 miles from the hospital nearly brought tears of joy to the doctor's eyes. After he hung up with the pharmacist, Dr. Liriano ran to the ER. When he got there, he assigned a nurse to wait by the entrance for the CEO's son, Michael, and the second he got there, this nurse was supposed to take the drug from him and rush it up to the critical care unit where Sebastian was. But there was still one other task that Dr. Liriano had to complete before they could institute this drug, and that was telling Sebastian's parents what was going on with Sebastian. Dr. Liriano steadied himself and then went down the hall to Sebastian's room. He peeked in at the doorway and saw Sebastian lying in bed, barely conscious. His parents, Brunilda and Raphael, sat on opposite sides of the bed, looking totally exhausted and terrified. Dr. Liriano stepped inside and then asked Sebastian's parents to please follow him out into the hall. Dr. Liriano could see in the parents' faces how much they were dreading whatever he was about to tell them. Once they were out in the hall, Dr. Liriano explained Sebastian's situation as clearly as he could. He said their son had caught an infection caused by a microorganism while he was swimming, and now this infection had spread deep into his body and his life was in danger. When he said this, the parents' faces went white. They stared at Dr. Liriano blankly. He told them the good news was that a new medication was on the way to the hospital this very second. The bad news was that Dr. Liriano had never been able to use this medication before, so he didn't know for sure if it would even work. Still, it was the best and potentially only chance they had against an infection with a very low survival rate. Only 3% of people who get this infection survive. Dr. Liriano gave the parents a few minutes to absorb this terrible news. Then he explained that in order to use this new medicine, they would have to put Sebastian into a medically induced coma, taking him to the brink of death in order to save his life. So if they wanted to say anything to Sebastian, now was the time. There might not be a later. Brunilda and Raphael nodded and went back into their son's room. They stood on either side of his bed and held his hands. His mother, Brunilda, cried as she told him what a perfect boy he was and that he was going to be just fine, medicine was on the way that would help him, and God was looking out for him. Sebastian's father, Raphael, made the sign of the cross and squeezed his son's hand. Then he leaned close to his face and told his son how strong he was, how he would beat this, and how they would all live a long, happy life together. Dr. Liriano was very moved by the parents and what they were saying to their son, but at some point he stepped in and asked Brunilda and Raphael to please leave the room, and then he had his nurses prep Sebastian for the medically induced coma, which required them to drastically lower Sebastian's body temperature. The team jumped into action, prepping IVs and hooking Sebastian up to various monitors. Dr. Liriano made sure everything looked good and headed out to the reception desk to wait for the impavido. The whole floor was tense with anticipation. Then the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. Dr. Liriano heard rapid footsteps, and suddenly a nurse sprinted around the corner holding a package. It was the impavido that Michael had brought. Dr. Liriano looked at his watch. He had called the pharmacy less than half an hour ago. Sebastian still had a chance. He ran back to Sebastian's room and quickly opened the container holding the impavido pills. Once Sebastian had taken them, an anesthesiologist sedated him. Within moments, Sebastian was asleep. A nurse gave him an IV drip of cold saltwater solution, while another wrapped him in frozen blankets. Dr. Liriano paced while keeping his eyes glued to Sebastian's monitor. This process would give the medication more time to work, but it was always very dangerous to cool a body so rapidly. Sometimes organs reacted very unpredictably. Within the hour, Sebastian's body temperature was down to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sebastian was officially comatose. Once Sebastian's breathing began to slow, Dr. Liriano gently fed a tube down his throat to help his body maintain a steady flow of oxygen. So far, the procedure had gone exactly as planned. All they could do now was wait and hope. The next morning, Dr. Liriano had some more of Sebastian's spinal fluid drawn to assess how the impavido was doing. He took the fluid down to the lab and studied it under a microscope, and when he looked, he let out a sigh of relief. There were already far fewer tiny wriggling creatures in the sample. The infection had significantly reduced. By the following morning, Dr. Liriano was beginning to believe that Sebastian was actually going to make it. He found Sebastian's parents half asleep on a bench in the waiting room. They jolted awake when he spoke to them. Dr. Liriano told them he didn't want to celebrate too early, but so far, all signs were very positive. When the parents heard this, they cheered and hugged the doctor tightly. But Dr. Liriano made it clear that Sebastian was not out of the woods yet. They still would have to bring him out of the medically induced coma. Dr. Liriano's team began steadily warming Sebastian's body. Minute by minute, his temperature rose until finally he was back at the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Liriano then removed Sebastian's breathing tube and then hovered at his bedside, waiting. Then it happened. Sebastian took a big gulp of air on his own, and his heartbeat remained steady. Sebastian was out of his coma. A little while later, Sebastian's eyes blinked open. He gazed around the room like he'd just woken up from a deep sleep. Dr. Liriano immediately sent a nurse to go get his parents. Brunilda and Raphael rushed inside and threw themselves on their son. Everyone in the room clapped, cheered, and hugged. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic, but also stunned. This wasn't just a miracle, it made history. What Sheila Black found in Sebastian's spinal fluid should have killed him. It's a rare organism called Naegleria fowleri that lives in warm, stagnant waters, exactly like the lake where Sebastian had been swimming. When infected water goes up a swimmer's nose, the microorganism then travels through the body to the brain. Once there, it attacks tissue, basically eating the victim's brain. This causes swelling that eventually shuts the brain down and the victim dies. That's why this organism is commonly known as the brain-eating amoeba. But what confirmed Sheila's hunch that this was a brain-eating amoeba was the organism's particular way of moving. It uses microscopic appendages to row itself like oars on a boat. That's why the microorganisms looked like they were wiggling under the microscope. In 57 years of documented brain-eating amoeba infections, Sebastian had become just the 4th person in the United States to survive after being attacked by them. Dr. Liriano told Sebastian's parents that their son had been both horribly unlucky, but also at the same time extremely lucky. Because if the medicine that ultimately saved his life had been stored basically anywhere else, he probably would not have gotten it in time. Of all the places in the world the medicine manufacturer's headquarters could be, they were also in Orlando, just a few miles from the hospital where Sebastian was. All told, it took less than 20 minutes for the CEO's son to rush and get the medicine and deliver it to the hospital. A few hours after coming out of his medically induced coma, Sebastian was able to speak again. It took 2 years for him to regain all his motor skills, but eventually he made a full recovery. And now for our second story, called Burning from the Inside. On a Sunday night, just after Christmas in 2015, 27-year-old Kayla Hansen weaved through the crowded dining room of Grimaldi's, a popular Italian restaurant in Peoria, Arizona. The restaurant was unusually busy that night. As the manager, it was up to Kayla to keep things organized. So she was doing a little bit of everything, helping out the waitstaff, checking on customers, and generally just making sure everything was running smoothly. For someone less experienced, this whole night might have been totally overwhelming. But Kayla was a veteran and workaholic who regularly put in 60 or 70-hour weeks. She was totally in her element. Closing time was fast approaching, so Kayla grabbed an order of pasta and raced out of the kitchen. As she crossed through the doorway, though, she let her guard down for a second and collided with one of her servers. The tray Kayla was carrying fell to the floor, and Kayla staggered back into the doorframe, and she grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, but before she could get her balance, the door swung back and smashed into her hand. Kayla cried out in pain and yanked her hand back. The server apologized and ran to get some ice, but Kayla waved her away. She wasn't bleeding, and she figured she just didn't have time to ice a minor injury like this. Kayla's hand was in a lot of pain, and she could feel it aching right away, but she shrugged it off and helped the waiter clean up the food that had spilled. Then Kayla finished up her shift and headed home, ready to get some sleep. The next morning, Kayla woke up and felt a throbbing pain in her right hand. She looked down and saw that it was totally swollen and the skin was bright red and tender. It didn't look good. Kayla groaned in frustration. She was supposed to meet her friends for a hike later, but as much as she wanted to ignore the pain in her hand, she knew she really needed to change her plans and go get her hand checked out by a doctor. So she texted her friends and said she would not be able to go on the hike that day, and then she called her primary care doctor and got an appointment for later that day. By the time Kayla got to the doctor's office that afternoon, her hand was really hurting. But when the doctor examined her hand, he told Kayla she had just bruised the soft tissue. Her hand wasn't broken, so the swelling would eventually go down and she'd be fine. Kayla was totally relieved to hear this. It would have been extremely difficult to work at the restaurant with a broken hand. So Kayla figured she'd get better in a couple of days and really just kind of stopped thinking about her hand. It still hurt, but it didn't feel like an urgent matter. 2 weeks later, Kayla was in her bathroom getting ready for the day, trying to brush her hair with her uninjured left hand. Her right hand, the damaged hand, was still swollen and tender, even though it had now been 2 weeks since she hurt it. The swelling really had not gone down at all, and the pain seemed to be getting worse every day. In fact, the pain had gotten so bad on several days over these past 2 weeks that she'd had to call into work sick. Kayla could not afford to keep taking time off of work, so she was starting to feel really worried about her hand again. Kayla fumbled the brush and shook her head in frustration. Then, just kind of out of instinct, she picked the brush back up with her damaged hand. And as soon as she grabbed it, it felt like an electric shock ran up her right arm. Kayla immediately dropped the brush and then grabbed her injured hand. She could feel the skin was incredibly hot to the touch, and it almost felt like it was on fire from the inside out. It was so painful. And now, also, her right arm hurt too, and it was beginning to swell just like her hand. Kayla realized she just couldn't push through this pain any longer. It was horrible, and so she decided she would go back to her doctor. Later that day, Kayla was in her doctor's office as the doctor was examining her swollen right arm. It took Kayla everything she could not to scream out in pain every time the doctor very gently pressed her hand or arm. After the doctor finished his exam, he told Kayla that this was clearly more than just a bad bruise to her hand. But it was not clear to the doctor why Kayla was in this much pain. Her tests and x-rays showed nothing was wrong with her. The doctor thought maybe it was something nerve-related. So he referred Kayla to a pain specialist named Dr. Nicholas Scott, whose focus was on identifying and managing chronic pain conditions. Kayla very carefully cradled her right arm as she thanked the doctor, and then she got up to leave. She hoped Dr. Scott would be able to help her, because she really didn't know how much more pain she could bear. A couple of weeks later, Kayla arrived at the Arizona Pain Clinic for her appointment with Dr. Scott. She hoped he would have an answer for her so she could get better and finally go back to her old life. Not only was she missing work all the time, but Kayla was also in too much pain to go hiking or fishing, or really do much of anything that she used to do for fun. Kayla waited in the exam room for a short period of time before Dr. Scott entered. His calm demeanor put her at ease, but she couldn't help but flinch when he examined her hand, which was still swollen and still had these bright red blotches all over it. Once he was done, Dr. Scott asked Kayla if she knew what might have caused the injury. She told him about her busy night at the restaurant at the end of December and how her hand had gotten smashed in a door, but she didn't see how such a minor injury could cause this much pain and swelling and over such a long period of time. Dr. Scott nodded and told Kayla he could not find any tissue damage or broken bones, just like her other doctor. However, he believed she had developed a rare condition called Complex Regional Pain Syndrome, or CRPS. It can develop after there's been nerve damage. He explained that a nerve in Kayla's injured hand was misfiring and sending signals to the brain that she was in extreme pain, even though the original hand injury was not that bad. Dr. Scott told Kayla that there was no cure for CRPS, but they could find a way to manage the pain and the burning sensation until it went into remission. Now, it usually went into remission after only a few months, but unfortunately for some, as the doctor explained, it could take a few years. Dr. Scott said they had no way of knowing which group Kayla would fall into. Kayla was relieved that Dr. Scott had a diagnosis, but the possibility of living with such excruciating pain for years on end was terrifying. She just hoped that the doctors and her medical team could somehow get this pain under control and get her back to normal life soon. About 9 months later, on December 16th, 2016, Kayla was in her kitchen struggling to cook some dinner. None of the pain treatments that Dr. Scott tried had worked. Over the past few months, the horrible burning pain in her right hand and arm had spread across her feet, hips, knees, neck, even her head. Basically, Kayla felt like she was on fire 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Kayla had lost count of how many times she'd been to the emergency room, but no matter what the doctors tried, the pain never lessened. She could barely get out of bed, she'd had to quit her job, and now she was relying on her family to help her financially. Kayla had worked so hard for so long to build her life, and now it was all crumbling all around her, and it seemed like there was nothing anyone could do to help her. Even worse, really dark, depressing thoughts began to cloud her mind every day. All she wanted was for the pain to end, even if that meant falling asleep and never waking up again. But Kayla was determined to try to find some ray of hope in her life, and she knew she got a lot of comfort from her family. So she had decided to invite them all over for a Christmas celebration where she would prepare a meal for everyone. And as she struggled to clear some dishes from the counter, Kayla happened to notice what looked like a fresh burn on her forearm. She tried to remember how she did this, maybe she bumped into the stove or something and didn't notice, but she really had no memory of getting a burn. Thankfully, though, the burn was small and didn't get any worse, and so Kayla was able to successfully host her Christmas party. It was only a small get-together, but the visit really lifted Kayla's spirits. But on the morning of December 20th, so 4 days after that Christmas party where she noticed that burn on her arm, Kayla woke up to find that her forearm, from hand to elbow, was now completely covered with these small circular burns, just like the one she had noticed 4 days earlier. They looked like someone had stuck her with a white-hot poker, leaving behind bright red blisters. But obviously that wasn't happening. These burns were somehow forming from underneath her skin. Kayla was shocked, and she lifted her arm up to get a better look. When she flexed it at the elbow, the movement caused the burns to crack open and start to bleed. It hurt so much, Kayla couldn't even think. She immediately laid back down and kept her arm at her side to avoid causing any more damage. Horrible thoughts began to fill her mind as she lay there in bed that morning. Kayla imagined grabbing a sharp knife and just cutting her arm off to escape the pain. She kept thinking about the incredible relief that would bring her. But then she realized cutting her arm off would be pointless because she knew from experience that these horrible pains she was experiencing would always eventually travel to the other parts of her body. Kayla gritted her teeth and then reached for her cell phone and called Dr. Scott. He was astonished by her alarming new symptoms. People with CRPS did sometimes develop burns like this, but Dr. Scott knew that was incredibly rare. In fact, it happens so infrequently within CRPS patients that nobody knew how to make it stop. So for now, the only advice Dr. Scott could give was for Kayla to get to the emergency room and hope the doctors there could do something to treat her burns. When Kayla hung up, she just started crying. She was in so much pain, she was so uncomfortable, and she knew that she was gonna go to the hospital because she was gonna do what she was told, but she knew they were not gonna be able to help her. No one could. Kayla was right. The doctors at the emergency room when she got there were totally baffled by her condition. The only burns like this they'd ever seen were from cancer patients going through radiation treatment. Whatever was doing this to Kayla was coming from inside her, and they just couldn't explain it. Kayla left the emergency room and headed home, still in total agony and feeling completely defeated. The days turned into months, the months turned into years, and at times, Kayla's situation felt completely hopeless. Somehow, she always found the strength to keep going despite the unbelievable pain she was always in. By February of 2019, over 3 years after she crushed her hand, Kayla had gone to over 50 different doctors and had tried almost as many medical procedures, but nothing had worked. Finally, though, on what felt like her millionth trip to the hospital for the burns that covered her body, the doctors were at least honest with her. They knew they couldn't help her, and they told her that, but they could at least tell her what was ailing her. She didn't just have CRPS. She had the worst case of CRPS they'd ever seen, and perhaps one of the worst the world has ever seen. Most people who suffer from complex regional pain syndrome have symptoms in a single arm or leg. Unfortunately for Kayla, she suffered from symptoms across her entire body. In other words, she had a unique version of this very rare disorder. One doctor described it as stage 4, the most severe and painful form of CRPS. Kayla had long since learned why doctors sometimes call CRPS the suicide disease, but the doctor spelled it out in agonizing detail. The pain experienced by victims of CRPS can be worse than childbirth, broken bones, or even amputations. The suffering can get so intense that up to 40% of CRPS victims express a desire to want to kill themselves to get rid of the pain. Kayla winced at that last detail because she knew she fell into that 40%. She had had those dark thoughts. And in fact, lying in the hospital bed at that very moment, she couldn't help but think about dying and how really it would be so much easier to just die, because then she wouldn't feel the pain and she'd stop being a burden to her parents and family. Over the next few days, doctors and nurses streamed in and out of Kayla's room really just to see the patient with the extraordinary case of CRPS. Some even took pictures of her just for documentation. Kayla started to feel like she was not really a patient and more of an animal in a zoo exhibit. Then eventually, Kayla's doctors discharged her from the hospital after this latest flare-up subsided, but they were unable to offer any further relief from her crippling full-body pain. A short time after Kayla returned home after that millionth visit to the doctor, something remarkable happened. All of a sudden, for no clear reason, the pain just started to lessen. At first, Kayla hardly noticed, but by April of 2019, she felt noticeably better. By the end of the year, she was no longer covered in those burns and was feeling almost like her old self again. Finally, after almost 4 years of just pain and misery and torture, Kayla's nervous system had healed enough to properly transmit signals to her brain, which meant she was more or less back to her normal self. Although her CRPS will never be completely gone, Kayla was able to return to an active life. She went back to work at a restaurant, and she was recently honored with an award for excellence as a manager.
Befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals. Silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, you know, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, you know, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, No, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent and they're really confused at what they see. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again. And it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father because he was this totally accomplished outdoorsman and he used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life. And so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him. And she had kind of become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars. And they're like, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple weeks ago and reserved a site because they're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk and they were like, you're in luck, we have one available, but it's the one that's way over there. It was this one campsite that was kind of isolated from the rest of the campground. It was far away from the bathhouse, it was far away from where you go swimming, and it was far away from the parking lot. It was just like really inconvenient. And whenever they came camping here, it was like the one site they didn't want to use. But beggars can't be choosers. They were happy to even have a site. And so they drove all the way down this little road into this very isolated campsite, kind of in the middle of this forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents because they were not going to be staying in the same tent. They each had these very small backpacking tents, which were so small that you could either zip it up all the way and stay warmer and more protected, but you had to sleep in a ball because your legs would not fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs are protruding outside of your tent. So you could only do that in warmer weather and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they set up their tents and they get their coolers set up and they have all their stuff kind of the way they want it, they go out hiking for the rest of the day. When they come back, they're totally exhausted, they fall asleep, and nothing of note occurs over that first night. The next day they get up, they go back out, they go hiking all day all over again, and they come back that night and they are totally exhausted again. And they get into their tents and they go to bed. And this night, something of note would happen. At about 3 a.m., Katie wakes up and she hears footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They're in the woods somewhere. And she's thinking, okay, it's got to be my father because he's diabetic and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3-4 times, and he probably was just walking to the bathhouse and now he's walking back. But she realizes the bathhouse is over here, not over here. So what is he doing walking towards the campsite from this side? The footsteps come out of the tree line, they come into the clearing that is their campsite, and they stop about 2-3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now there were no windows on Katie's backpack tent, there was just little vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down, and so she couldn't see out anyways, and there was no illumination out, so you can't even pick up a silhouette. It's just total darkness out there, she can't see who's out there, she can only hear them. But she's thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that goes to the bathhouse. And so she's running through these scenarios that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wants to hear is that person walk away from her tent and get into her father's tent, because that will confirm in her mind that that was her father. And so she's sitting here waiting for that confirmation, and she hears the footsteps again, but instead of walking around her tent to her father's tent, this person walks right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly begin leaning over her little tiny tent because she can hear them breathing right above her. And this is when she realizes, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse revelation. It was a warm night that night, so she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She musters the courage to begin slowly retracting her legs back inside of her tent. But before she's able to do that, this person stands up, turns, and starts walking towards the base of her tent where her legs are. She's completely frozen and terrified about what's about to happen. But this person doesn't stop at her feet. They keep moving and in fact start circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise and walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without, this person hearing her. And so she had the illusion of safety being inside of her tent, but her tent is still unzipped. So she's waiting for this person to come around and crouch down and look inside of her tent because it's open. And so she's just looking down there hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop, right outside where the opening to the tent is. And so she's sitting there thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet are pulled up into her tent, she suddenly feels something pinch her foot, and she knows it's a hand. Something has grabbed my foot. And she stifles a scream and she starts shaking uncontrollably because her instincts are telling her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she's sitting there shaking from fear and trying to be quiet as best as she can, she's holding her mouth. This person stands back up again and goes back to the spot next to her tent and leans over the tent once again, and she can hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there shaking with this random person who pinched her foot a minute ago, hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she has nothing she can do. And she's just quiet. She's hoping it's going to end soon. And eventually this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their table and some other things that were out. And she hears some rummaging going on. Some things are being moved around. And then this person just kind of walks off into the distance. But she doesn't know if they're gone. She doesn't know if they're standing in the edge of the tree line waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they laid a trap for her. And so she just lays there, silent, doesn't move, and she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night she's just laying there. And then eventually she does fall asleep. Probably hours go by, but she does fall asleep because she wakes up again when she hears her father unzipping his tent, and she charges out to meet him. And she can tell right away that he's scared. And before she can even say or begin to describe what's happened to her, he says, were you outside your tent last night at about 2, 3 in the morning? Because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I wasn't sure if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler, and they had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents, they kept near this picnic table. And he points at it. And she turns around, and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out has been stacked in a pyramid formation on this table. Clearly, the guy who was here last night did this for some reason they don't understand. And as they go over to look at it to see if anything's been taken, they notice this track of footprints, like these heavy footprints that have been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And so that instant, they packed everything up, got in their car, and they left. And to this day, they can barely talk about it with each other because it's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person but didn't leave his tent. And his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter's thinking, the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. Like, that's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore.
Me susurra tu nombre, las estrellas brillan como aquella vez. Recuerdos de lo que fuimos no se van, siguen vivos en mi alma. ¿Dónde estás? Tal vez el destino nos vuelva a cruzar. En tus ojos yo me pueda reflejar un suspiro de esperanza en el aire. Siento que mi corazón no late. Si un día nos volvemos a encontrar, te diré todo lo que callé. El amor que guardé para ti, nunca lo dejé de sentir. Si el tiempo
From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was two others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned, because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist. There's vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and grass is growing all through them. And so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room table still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, like, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling